All right. In this last section, we're going to be talking about dissociative disorders, personality disorders, suicide, and childhood disorders. So, first of all, dissociative disorders involves a loss of connection with some part of our consciousness, identity, or memory. Dissociative disorders involve an amnesia, multiple personalities, or depersonalization. And sometimes people who have this condition will feel like they're outside of their bodies. They may behave like robots or like they're lost in a dream world. There are different types. One type is called dissociative fugue. This is where a person may suddenly travel away from home. They'll be confused about their identity. It's like temporary amnesia, and oftentimes it will last for maybe a few hours, but sometimes it'll last for a few weeks or even up to years. Oftentimes they'll wake up and it's like, they're snapped back to reality. There's another condition called dissociative identity disorder. It used to be more commonly known as multiple personality disorder, but now it's known as DID, or dissociative identity disorder. This is the presence of two or more distinct personalities in an individual, and it may or may not be real. It's kind of hard to tell. I do have a interesting video of an artist who has DID, and she talks about her experience and the different personalities that have inhabited her. And it is really fascinating to see. And because she's an artist, the different types of art styles depends on the personality that she's in at the time of the artwork being created. There is a condition or type of dissociative disorder that is called somatic symptom disorder and related disorders. This is where they have physical symptoms that mimic a disease or injury. They may experience paralysis, blindness, illness, and chronic pain, but there's no identifiable physical cause. It is all psychological. Some individuals, they will interpret just normal bodily sensations as proof of a terrible disease. This is known as hypochondria. This is, common in older adults usually, where part of it is, they like the attention that comes from going to doctors and having tests done and family members worrying about them. But again, it's psychological, not physical. So oftentimes they're expressing their anxiety through bodily complaints. Some people will experience debilitating pain that has no physical basis. One condition that relates to this is called Munchausen syndrome. For these individuals, they may even go to the point where they will hurt themselves or poison themselves or somehow make themselves sick in order to gain access to medical facilities and attention from doctors and family members in the greater community. There's also Munchausen by proxy, and this is where individuals will do this to an older family member or a child, sicken and weaken them, and gain medical help. And oftentimes, especially if a person, the child is severely ill, the community kind of wraps around them and provides them trips and freebies and giveaways and things like that. There's a famous documentary series about this that recently came out. I forget what it's called, but I think it's on Hulu. You can check that out. Now we're going to go into personality disorders, and this is there's 3 clusters of these. Antisocial and borderline, though, are the most common, and then we're going to talk about those. So for personality disorder is a maladaptive personality pattern, but it's deeply ingrained and unhealthy in that individual. This is kind of like delusions. They may feel paranoid. They feel like other people are out to get them. They may be narcissistic, very self-focused, and nothing is ever their fault. There's individuals who are what they call histrionic. They constantly seek attention by dramatizing their emotions and actions. They may cry, they may be elated, and all of it's to get attention on themselves. They may have dependent personality disorders where they constantly seek support and reassurance. They're very clingy. And there's antisocial. This is where a person lacks of conscience, and this is where we get into like sociopathy. So antisocial personality disorder, these individuals demonstrate a chronic pattern of impulsive and irresponsible behavior. They will violate the rights of others, and they lack empathy. They just don't have that conscience. They don't feel any remorse or guilt for hurting other people. They will often repeatedly lie and may manipulate others into doing what they want. Sometimes it's, to gain financial access or, to gain other, rewards. but it also might just be the fun of messing with other people. They are typically antisocial, and they typically start these behaviors when they're in childhood and adolescence. Oftentimes, they will start off hurting animals before they will hurt other people. But the interesting thing is that not all criminals have antisocial personality disorder, and not all the people who have antisocial personality disorder are criminals. Oftentimes, they can use their antisocial personality disorder to their benefit to do really well in careers where being more cutthroat and more manipulative has advantages. So think of like, high powered business people, CEOs, politicians, lawyers, where, being able to manipulate a person and really understand how to get them to do what you want is a really big benefit. So they may or may not be violent. They just become, very skilled con artists or high powered politicians and business people. And the prevalence rate is about 1 in 25 people. So, on average in our class, we have probably one person who would fall within the antisocial personality scale. There's different tests of this you can do online. It's not terribly common. And again, the extreme violent parts of the antisocial personality disorder are very uncommon. But otherwise, it's a fairly common condition that's relatively benign. There's a great book called I think it's called The Psychopath Next Door, The Sociopath Next Door. Excellent book. It's all about this. I also have, I believe, a couple articles. There was a guy, a neuroscientist, who was doing brain scans of sociopaths in prison, and he was also doing an Alzheimer's study. And he was going back and forth where he's looking at the brain scans, and that day he was looking at the Alzheimer's scans. And he had noticed, though, in the people who had the antisocial personality disorder, they had really interesting brain anatomy that to the point where you could like pick it out of a pile of brain scans, like, oh, this person has APD. And he was going through the pile of Alzheimer's scans, and he's like, wait, this scan's in the wrong pile. It's in the Alzheimer's pile. It should be in the APD pile. And of course, they're all anonymized. And he was like, we got to get this sorted out. Like, let's double check this. So they went to the records. It turns out it was his own brain scan, and he had no idea that he had APD. So when he asked his wife, she was like, oh, well, yeah, you definitely do. And gave him a couple of examples of how he interacts with other people that showed, these tendencies. And he was like shocked. And then we talked to more people, and they were like, yeah, we kind of could have told you that. Surprised you didn't pick it up yourself. And then he looked into his family history, like his genealogy, and turns out he was related to a bunch of criminals and murderers, including Lizzie Borden, who, if you know the story, like killed her employers that she worked for, like with an axe. It's crazy. But there's a couple interesting stories about that on Canvas, and I believe there may also be a podcast about that gentleman. There's also borderline personality disorder. These individuals demonstrate instability of their mood, self-image, and interpersonal relationships. They lack impulse control, and they may engage in self-destructive behaviors such as cutting and other self-harm behaviors. We also have personality disorders. They consider this to be part of cluster C, as they call it. There is avoidant personality disorder. They have patterns of social inhibition, feelings of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation. There is dependent personality disorder, pervasive and excessive need to be taken care of that leads to submission and clingy behavior and fear of separation. And then we have, very confusingly called, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. These individuals have pervasive patterns of preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and mental and interpersonal control at the expense of flexibility, openness, and efficiency. Now, OCPD, personality disorder, and OCD are not the same. People with OCD have the unwanted intrusive thoughts and urges, and they recognize that it is irrational what they're trying to do. People with OCPD, they think their way of functioning is correct and that everyone else is crazy. And they relate the world through their own strict standards and think that everyone else is nuts for not following along. So with OCD, they recognize that it's an incorrect thought pattern. With OCPD, they do not recognize that it's an incorrect thought pattern. So that's the difference. All right, now we're talking about suicide. This is a difficult topic, but this is more relating to how to prevent and how to recognize the signs. So, what do we know about suicide? We know that it's more common for men to die by suicide than women, and it's most common with white males, but we do see very high rates in Native Indian or American Indian and Alaskan Native populations. Because those communities are usually very low income, there are high rates of substance abuse disorders, poverty, and kind of a lack of social. They have a community, but it's like a community that is filled with trauma based off historical events. They are at very high rates of, and there's lack of access to mental health services as well, in general mental or medical supports. So this is a very wordy slide. I apologize, but I think the information is really interesting and really important. So suicide, although most people who talk of suicide do not go on to attempt suicide, people who die by suicide typically have expressed their intentions at some time or at one point to a family member or a friend before their attempt. They may talk about going away or be preoccupied with the notion of death. Therefore, anytime anyone talks about suicide, that talk should be taken very seriously. A person who is suicidal should not be left alone. If you need to, try to contact a mental health professional. You can call 911 or call a suicide crisis hotline in your area. If you're not with the person, you can call 911 and ask them for a well check to that person's residence. You can call suicide crisis hotlines. They can help you out. They can direct you to services. There are also text-in services. If you yourself need help, you can text with these crisis hotlines, and they're excellent, and they're available every single day, 24 hours a day. If you ask a person direct questions about their plan for suicide, that's actually important. It's not going to increase the likelihood of them actually attempting suicide. And that's the only way to really assess the person's risk. So if you bring up the subject, it gives a person an opportunity to talk about his or her problem. People who have a concrete mind and plan for when and how they're going to end their life are more likely to attempt suicide than those who have plans that are less specific. In the United States from 2003 to 2007, young women ages 15 to 44 who had died by suicide, 37% had a history of suicide attempts. Similarly, among adolescents, a previous history of suicide attempts is the single best predictor of future suicide attempts and completions. Therefore, to prevent previous suicide attempts, put adolescents and young adults and middle-aged women and particularly at higher risk for future suicide attempts. So, again, there's a lot of information here. Please, if you ever feel like you need to end your life, please reach out to someone, especially a mental health professional. Obviously, here at school, we have a variety of services that you can access. But you can call 911. You can reach out to a friend. You can go to one of these or to speak to someone at a crisis hotline, text in or call in. You can just Google these. They're available, and they can help you out. Suicide is not an answer, even though it may feel like it at the time. These feelings, while they may be persistent, can change over time with proper help. And all of us are available to you guys to make sure that you guys are safe. Again, it's very hard when you may have a friend who may be experiencing these feelings. You guys are not mental health professionals. You cannot, stop a person from doing something that, is harmful. So please reach out to a trusted adult, call 911, contact a crisis hotline, and make sure that person gets some help. They'll say like, don't tell my parents or don't tell anyone. It's better that they're mad at you than they're dead. So please reach out whenever you sense that this may be an issue with someone that you love. All right. We are going to be talking now at the end of this chapter about disorders of childhood and adolescence. So we're going to be covering autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which are the two most common disorders in childhood and adolescence. So autism spectrum disorder is characterized by impairment in social communication and social interaction. This could be verbal interaction and also like the more subtle things that we do with our bodies to indicate our interest or disinterest in a conversation. That body language, we say a lot of things verbally that we don't actually mean literally, and that can be really difficult for a person who is on the spectrum to pick up on. They may also have restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior. They may have restrictive interests and activities that they're interested in. So they might be really focused on like, one thing like bugs or something. They're just really interested in that. There's an excellent show on Netflix called Atypical. It's about an adolescent male who has autism, and he is really interested in penguins in the Antarctic, and that's his very specific interest. Oftentimes, they're also overwhelmed by sensory information, so lots of noise may be overwhelming. They may have to remove themselves. They'll do what's called stimming, where they have repetitive behaviors that can help calm them. So whether it's rocking or shaking their hands, wearing things like headphones to block out external noises that can be overwhelming can be really helpful for them. So it just depends on the individual. And like I showed you guys at the beginning, like there's different kind of levels for each one of these different types of patterns of behavior that may or may not be higher or lower for an individual or on certain days depending on their level of stress. We also have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. This is characterized by inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity. As we've talked about in the past, it's not a really well named disorder. It should be inhibition deficit disorder. Those with ADHD, they have really wide attention and they have a hard time focusing their attention and kind of shifting their attentional spotlight as needed. So things that are around them in the environment may pull their attention and disrupt their focus on schoolwork or conversation or cleaning activities, things like that. Now, it's all considered to be ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but some people don't have the hyperactivity, and that's more common in girls. Oftentimes, boys will be quickly diagnosed at a younger age with ADHD, but girls with ADD are usually not diagnosed until much later, if not adulthood, if at all. So we do see it in girls almost as frequently as boys, just it's harder to get the diagnosis. And so there's a video on that. And there's also a video, a TED Talk that is really excellent. I hope you take a few minutes and watch. I think it's like 15 minutes. And those are available in the playlist for you as well. I will say the ADHD one isn't the best video. It's a little boring, but the information is excellent. So if you're interested in that, please check that out. Oh, okay. This is looking about suicide. I meant to move that slide. So we've kind of already talked about this. Thank you very much.